you today a little bit about these decisions about content versus configuration, particularly when you're dealing with a content management system, trying to figure out which markup to wrap around things can be really complicated, and there's lots of different ways you can do it. I originally started with these 2 C's, and every time I started working on this presentation, I actually ended up with 4. There's also code and context, which we'll talk about a little bit later too. So just to start things off, I want to give you a little bit of background on me. I consider myself old school, but there's probably a bunch of people here who've been doing web development a lot longer than I have. I started building websites in 1997, which is actually when I was in high school. The internet was a very different place back then. There wasn't any CSS, which means all of the code was hideously ugly, and so were most of the websites. I used to use a lot of tables for layouts, and tables within tables within tables, which of course made my sanity a little fragile. I used to have like pieces of quadrille paper with visual diagrams of which cell I was trying to edit so that I could go through and find whatever it was. I discovered Dreamweaver at the very beginning as a IDE. Actually had some kind of a WYSIWYG editor, which I thought was absolutely crazy, and played with it a lot. And I might have posted some of my first websites on GeoCities. I then went to college and learned about real computer science, graduated and got going the wrong way, a real job in web. I moved back to the Bay Area and actually was like, wow, you know, HTML was really easy compared to all that stuff I was doing in school. But it turns out that the internet had changed a lot in the 4 years that I was away from it, and I needed to teach myself a whole bunch of stuff I've never even heard of, like CSS. I ended up building a bunch of standard HTML websites and realizing that that wasn't a very good way to do things. I learned how to use PHP and JSP and was like, well, we had some fancy templating system we could use, and ended up writing one of those before realizing that a bunch of people had come before me and done a much better job. I had a client who wanted to log in and update their own website, so I kind of built my own content management system also before realizing that there was definitely a lot better ways to handle these problems that were already out there. Turns out it's actually really hard. As soon as you look at a good example of a content management system and think about how you were doing it, you're like, oh man, that's like so I discovered the world of open source, where everything is free and there's lots of code available and you can play with everything you want. I used a bunch of it. We did a bunch of social networking stuff, e-commerce stuff, client relationship management stuff, and eventually content management systems too. We evaluated everything that was available, this was back in the day, and made some decisions about what we wanted to use as a company and what I wanted to use personally, since I was the loudest one there. And I found and fell in love with Drupal. I've been using Drupal since 2006. I played with it a little bit before that, but didn't actually commit until 2006. I started getting involved in the Drupal open source community, which is actually really strong in this area, and started running a camp called the Bay Area Drupal Camp, or BAD Camp, in 2007. And just a little interlude, if you guys like what you hear here, or don't, and want to know more about Drupal, BAD Camp is just a couple weeks away. It's November 1st through 4th. It's at the UC Berkeley campus. It is completely free. We have 2 days of summits leading up to the camp and 2 days of sessions, much like today and tomorrow, only it'll be more Drupal focused and less kind of generally web focused. Back to Drupal. I started writing my first code for Drupal back in 2008 and realized that since I got most of the code that I was using for free, I should give away all of the code that I wrote for free and posted stuff on Drupal.org, got involved in issue queues and maintenance and all of the stuff that goes along with that, and actually really enjoyed it. I organized DrupalCon San Francisco in 2010, which was here in the city. We had over 3,100 people registered, more than 3,000 people attended. It's probably my biggest accomplishment to date. I'm impressed that we managed to pull it off, and apparently it was a pretty good conference. I was really tired, so I don't remember most of it, but it was a lot of fun. And starting directly after the DrupalCon in 2010, we had a couple of days of training right before the conference, and we ended up training 500 people. All of our classes were sold out. Everybody wanted more training, and the company I was working for was like, you know what? We should figure out how to do this training thing. Apparently, everyone needs training. So I went back to the office and started writing materials and teaching classes and revising materials and teaching more classes, and eventually realized that Drupal is hard, and it's not the lack of materials or the lack of training that's the problem. It's the condition of the open source community and how software gets developed. And I became an accidental core contributor to the Drupal project. So when you get really angry about something and start like making a bunch of noise about how it needs to be better, in the open source world, people say, well, then why don't you fix it? And then you have to fix it. So the first thing I found in Drupal core that I thought needed to be changed was a test in the testing framework that said that the bunny's ears were furry. And I'm like, who's ever heard of a bunny with furry ears? Everybody knows that bunnies are fuzzy. And this needs to be changed right away. And I figured this was a really good place where I could kind of put my toe in the water and see what it was like to change something in core. And it turns out that there were like 8 core developers who were like, every time I read that test, I think bunny ears should be furry or fuzzy instead of furry. And we've got to do this right now. And they just committed it. And I was like, huh, well, that was pretty easy. All right, let's go and try and change something real. So I started making a bunch of little changes specifically related to usability and something I like to call learnability, which helps people who get into Drupal try and figure out what the heck they're doing with it. And it seemed like all of these other people all over the Drupal community, all over the world, started coming to the same conclusions at the same time. And that was basically that anyone in web comes into Drupal and they always start in the same place. They want to change what it looks like. They want to go and change what's called a theme in Drupal, which is your HTML and your CSS, and guess what? That's the most common language of the web, and everyone from every platform understands a little bit about HTML and CSS. And what we've done in the last version of Drupal is basically abstract the whole theme layer to a point where anyone new coming to Drupal was like, I don't know what to do with that, and then they would leave, right? So we don't even know all the people who aren't using Drupal. We know about some people who are complaining about it. There's the ones who like stuck to it and saying that it's too hard, and then there's all of the rest of us who've been around for forever. And we're like, what's the big deal? It's just, another layer of abstraction. Why don't you understand in that? And so all these different people came together and they're like, there's this problem with our theme layer. We need to redo it. And so in the next version of Drupal, which I'll talk about again a little bit later, we're trying to rip out the theme layer that's in there now, which is kind of a Drupalized version of the PHP template, and replace it with Twig, which is a new templating language or system thing. It's kind of like Smarty, but much smarter, I guess. So that's me. I'm not a front-end person. I don't really care about the quality of my HTML and my CSS. I've been trained in the Drupal way for too long to just like stick a style sheet on it and hopefully it'll like come out kind of how you want. But there are a lot of really angry HTML and CSS and front-end people in our community, and they can't speak to the back-end engineers who are telling them just to deal with the code that comes out of Drupal. They don't really, it's not the same language. So I'm like the interpreter where I'm like, these people are angry, and these people are grumpy, and trying to like figure out how to get a new theme layer in the middle. And part of the problem that we're dealing with in this next version of Drupal is that our developer community and our front-end community can't really make any decisions about where control of things should lie. And so I'm basically here to talk to you guys who know about the front end to try and figure out, explain some of our problems and figure out where we should go for our next iteration. So, how many people in the room have heard of Drupal before this? Oh, that's great. Okay, so really quickly, just to get a poll of who you are. How many of you consider yourselves like front-end developers, like you do HTML and CSS? I'm hoping that's everyone. Okay, good, because I wrote the right time. And then how many of you do work in the back end too, like PHP, MySQL, whatever? Okay. How many of you are user interface designers? Okay, so we kind of have the same issue in our community where, well, actually, we have hardly any front-end developers, but we have a lot of back-end developers and nobody who cares about user interaction. So what happens, the developer's like, oh, I built this awesome integration thing, all you have to do is push this button, and they'll tuck it like in the bottom, like right-hand corner, like maybe the horizontal scroll where no one can find it, and they're like, I don't know why people don't understand how to use this thing, because it's like, they're never gonna push the button, and they're never gonna know what it actually does, whatever designer wanted. So what I'm trying to do is figure out how to take the pieces that are really cool that developers like, and actually make them usable for people on the front end. Okay, so Drupal does not rhyme with Drupal. People call it Drupal all the time. It's one of my pet peeves. So if you haven't heard of Drupal before now, it's not Drupal, it's Drupal. So that's that. Drupal is free, which I like to say free as in pony, because even though like you can download it and install it for free, it's actually really expensive to like maintain and like feed and host and all the stuff that goes along with it ends up being kind of expensive. But I still like to say that it's free because there's no fees associated with it or anything, but we'll see. It's also open source, which, as you all know, I'm really passionate about. I like being able to open things up and see how they work. I like being able to change things when you don't like how they work. It turns out it's a much easier process in this community than I usually thought. There's kind of a stigma about being someone who makes something that other people use, but it turns out like code's not that good anyway, like anyone can contribute and you'll probably make it better. So that's a really cool thing about open source. It's community supported, so that means like everyone in this room, if you wanted to, could support Drupal for free. Yay. Drupal in and of itself has a really, really great community. This is a picture from DrupalCon DC, which was the year before San Francisco, and it's just all the people in Northern California. We've got a whole bunch of conferences that happen nationally and internationally every year, and people get together and solve really hard problems and build really confusing user interfaces, which we'll talk about a little later. And it's really fun to like work with fellow nerds. The same thing. It's considered a content management system. That means a bunch of different things to a bunch of different people. I like to call it a content management framework, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the concept of a content management system is basically true for Drupal. And I like to explain that as a separation of roles for people who are interacting with this website. Every website has visitors, right? People who come and read it. But different websites have different levels of administration. And something like Drupal, or a content management system, separates the editor experience, these are the people who are writing the articles and creating the content, from an administrator experience, and these are the people who can grant those editors specific permissions to do stuff. You can have any number level of things in between, or higher or lower, or however you want it. Drupal also has a kind of a site builder role, which is kind of maybe you're a developer, maybe you do themes, or maybe it's kind of this weird, mushy middle land, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. But none of these people who log into a website and make changes are developers. So most of the development on a Drupal site happens before it launches, and then after it launches, you just kind of go, here's your toy, and then all of these administrators come in and interact with it and create content. And so as developers, we need to make decisions for how that content is going to be displayed for the people who are creating them after the fact. And that can be really hard when the types of content are created can be really different. So how do developers feel about Drupal? Well, developers absolutely love Drupal. It's really modular, it's really extensible, it's really flexible. It's written in PHP, which is kind of a sloppy language, but it's great for the real world because you have clients who are demanding stuff that's really messy. And so you're like, well, I don't really like the way this code works, but I want it done tomorrow, so I'm just going to do it. And there's a bunch of other frameworks that are like really strict about how you have to do things, and that means that you have to go back to clients and be like, sorry, that's not possible. That's not really an issue in Drupal. Everything is possible. It's just like, sorry, that's going to be really expensive. That's really the answer you've got to give them. This is a part of the reason why I like to call it a framework, just because you can take this core piece of Drupal and bend it into absolutely anything you need. It can be an intranet, it can be an extranet, it can be whatever you want. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of sites that are out there that are currently using Drupal. The music industry, there's both Warner and Sony have all of their artists on Drupal sites, which is pretty crazy. So you can have Drupal running everything from Britney Spears to the Grateful Dead. Those are kind of like complete extremes of music, and Drupal's like, I got them both covered, no problem. In news media, we've got a bunch of really big US conglomerates using it. The Economist has Drupal, and so do a bunch of international other news outlets that maybe need things like Drupal's translation internationalization interfaces, which is pretty cool. We've got governments all over the world running Drupal, everything from whitehouse.gov to China's retired soldiers network. So you've got governments as different as US and China using the same platform. That's also pretty cool. We've got educational institutions, Stanford here on the East Coast, Harvard on the West Coast, everything in between. Everyone likes Drupal, especially educational institutions, because it's free, and since it's open source, they can deal with it in-house, which means all of their IT people get to keep their jobs, which makes them pretty happy. We have nonprofit institutions all over the world also using Drupal, again, because it's free, and because nonprofits have this ability to pool their resources together to solve the same problems in open source space. So if you have two different nonprofits that are trying to use the same module and they both need some feature on it, and either one can only afford half of the development on it, they can come together and say, well, let's pool our resources and we can get this feature done and we can both have it when it's done, which is also pretty cool. We have e-commerce sites, everything from Zappos, which runs on a really crazy Drupal backend and has its own front end, to sites like IKEA. This is not the US IKEA site, but another one also runs Drupal. And one system has to create all of these different kinds of websites, different kinds of content, different types of experiences for everyone on the web. And that makes it really hard for us, makes it really hard for us to come up with rules that control the markup around all of this different kind of content. You've got different layouts, you've got different uses, you've got different contexts. How do we make a decision from a programmatic standpoint what to wrap different elements in? So I've got a list of all of the things that we did assume were safe for the next version of Drupal. We'll go through some of the things that aren't safe and ways to solve those later. But in Drupal 7, so that's the current version of Drupal that you would download and install today, we've got this duck type that you can override in your theme layer, but for the most part it's the same on the page. If we want Drupal 8 to use HTML5, we've got to change that everywhere, and that duck type will be the same for every one of those websites no matter what, so that's a pretty safe assumption to make. Our page layouts, everything right now is divs. If anyone's tried to do anything with Drupal, you know we absolutely love divs. We also really like classes, and we'll give you more classes than you need in every place possible, just in case someone might want something different. We'll just throw in a couple extras. And so what we're going to be able to do in Drupal 8 is kind of clean up those divs and replace them with elements that are better suited for positioning in your layout, which is good. There's some semantic stuff that we can assume will be correct. Drupal comes with a couple of different types of content by default, and I'm just going to refer to these as articles, but you can think of them as posts. You can create any one yourself, of course, since the system's dynamic, but for the most part, articles can have article tags, and that's a very straightforward change to make. Similarly for comments, Drupal is a commenting system. Almost every website has comments. Those are almost always articles too, so we've assumed that that's a safe change to make also. There's a whole bunch of new fancy HTML5 form elements. People want these now, so of course there's a bunch of modules that already exist in Drupal that implement these, but we want to put these into the core so that you get them automatically with the next version of Drupal. So we've gone ahead and added every one of the new HTML5 form elements so that it's available for use in the next version, and tried to update most of the existing interfaces, both administrative and otherwise, to use these elements, so that if you needed to do a mobile-first content entry, oh, I forgot to do whatever, and I'm on the train on the way to work, and I've got to update the website, you'd still be able to deal with the correct kind of interaction that way. We also have a whole bunch of new form attributes in HTML5. In previous versions of Drupal, we had a bunch of JavaScript that we'd added to kind of mimic these effects, just to make it all backwards compatible with IE6 and all that horrible stuff. So we've stripped all that out. Our code base is getting a lot lighter, which is great. We're no longer supporting IE6, and there's like a kind of a riot going on as to whether we should abandon IE7 or not. The next version of Drupal isn't due out until a year from now, so there's a lot of we'll see. So form attributes, we've added those in as well. We had a JavaScript file that let us do resizing on the text areas, and we can replace that with new CSS3 resizing, which is good. And for sites that do still need to use older versions, i.e. we've added Shiv into core to make a lot of this stuff work, and we've updated to the latest version of jQuery. We'll probably update to the latest version of jQuery again before Drupal 8 comes out, because it updates a lot faster than we do in general. So hopefully that will solve most of the IE problems that we actually care about. So let's talk about some of the things that are not safe to assume about controlling your content in CMS. Markup. So Drupal has a system of adding fields to different types of content. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with fields. WordPress does this too, and you can add stuff. So with Drupal, its field system is really quite elaborate, and if you wanted to add a video field, it'll reference an external source. If you want an image field, it has information about the file that's associated with it. Something like a tags field like this is a reference to a library that you can link to directly, and you can have different uses for all of this stuff every time you create a piece of content. So you've got dates for events and all that stuff. How you want that markup formatted will vary wildly, depending on not only what that field is, but what it's attached to, who's looking at the page, anything you could possibly imagine. So it's really dangerous for us to make an assumption about what kind of wrappers we should put around that thing. So by default, Drupal's like, well, I'm going to give you 3 wrappers around every field. And if you have a label, there's 4, I think. But then you can have as many as you want, everything's self-contained. And then the people who have to write CSS for this get really mad, and they're like, why are there 3 wrappers around this one thing? Like, every time I have it, there's only one thing there, and there's 3 wrappers. In this case, I think there's actually 5, because I've also got wrappers around each one anyway. It's a mess. And so we've got a bunch of front-end developers who yell at their back-end developers, and they write them modules that let them control this markup. So now we've got this kind of weird hybrid of like, do you override it in code, or now we have this module that overrides it, and then the module also present can override it, and it gets really messy. I'll show you a little bit of that later. List items. So Drupal has this really powerful module called views that lets you create lists of anything. In this screenshot, we've got 4 lists, maybe in the sidebar. One of them's a list of like advertising stuff that's just images. The second one's a list of like recent content that has an image and a link to that article. And then the third one's just like a bulleted list. These are all generated by the same module. And so you have to be able to choose like, well, do I want that to be the same every time, or do I want like different tags around different kinds of lists? And how does Drupal know what kind of list it is? I need to be able to tell it some way, so there's got to be some kind of interface. And in the previous versions of Drupal, there was no way to control this at all, except for by doing a bunch of coding. Everyone got really mad about that. And so they wrote a module to solve the problem. In the latest version of Drupal, Drupal 7, we integrated that module into views. So now views has an option when you go to create a list. It's like, okay, you want an ordered list or an unordered list. It's going to have links in it. Do you want an extra tag? Do you want tags removed? Or do you want extra classes? The classes removed. And people loved it. I was really against it. I'm like, oh, no. If people write code, we should give them code. And people write code and they don't interact with the user interface. No one who interacts with the user interface is going to understand the code anyway. But we put it in and everyone loved it. So I'm like, okay, that was wrong. So the question is, like, how do you know when to make those assumptions and how much control do you give people over it? And then the last item, this is also relating to layout. This is something the Drupal world calls blocks, and other systems I think they're called widgets, where they're basically like giant chunks of HTML that may, in this case, contain lists. They could contain other things, like maybe it's just an ad. But you can position these blocks on your page. Like maybe you have one page that has 3 columns and 3 blocks of equal width, and then you have one page that's got like maybe 2/3 and 1/3 layout. And the positioning of these blocks, sometimes it's an aside, sometimes it's nav, how do you know? And that's also really different based on the content that's inside that block. But now you're running into this issue where we've got blocks, and we've got lists inside the blocks, and we've got items inside the lists. How much control do we give people over all of these different elements? So let's talk about how Drupal is trying to solve some of these. So I talked about some of this already. The unsafe things, an ad with an image, maybe it doesn't need a figure tag around it because you don't want people to actually care about it. Something like if something's in the sidebar, even if it's the same content on another page where it's an article, does it change? Does it become an aside, or do you want an aside and an article? And do people building these websites have different opinions about how these things should be formatted? And this is the one thing that I keep running into when I'm sitting in on these meetings and all these HTML5 people are sitting around the table, and they all think they know the right way to do it, right? And you're like, well, you guys are building different websites, so maybe your answers are different, but maybe you just have different opinions. Maybe, you know, your right way, this HTML5 stuff is kind of new. We've got some guidelines, but depending on the content and the context and the person creating it, they're going to have different needs. So where do we give people control over these things? Traditionally in Drupal, HTML has only ever been controlled in the theme. And now we're starting to change that a little bit, and it's getting into this crazy gray area of sometimes it's just too much. So let's talk a little bit about how Drupal constructs a page. And this is the conveyor belt version. This is actually much more complicated, but I go to a page in my browser and I go, I want to see website.com. And the website goes, aha, that's a URL. I'm going to feed that into this PHP system, and then there's this crazy router that figures out what's supposed to be on that page. It says, okay, I know what's going to be on the page, but I've got to go to the database and get some information. So the PHP talks to the database, it retrieves whatever it needs, and if it's items for a list, it could be an article, it could be an image. It's got to figure out where the file is stored, so it goes to the database, gets the file location, comes back, goes gets the file, sticks it all together. And it wraps it all together in a whole bunch more PHP or HTML, and then it hands it off to this theme layer. And the theme layer can say, hold on a minute, I don't like this HTML that came from the previous module layer, and I'm going to change it all. So it replaces it with a series of templates or functions and cleans up and puts whatever HTML it wants on it. And then it sticks it together into a page and delivers it back to the browser. So that theme layer ultimately has complete control over all of the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, anything that comes out of your Drupal site. So it's easier for me to say, why put any control anywhere in the logic or the content? Just let the front end control all the markup. But then you start running into these issues where your content creators want WYSIWYG editors. You're like, well, now I'm saving HTML tags in the database, and like, how do you control that? Maybe you've got to have like regular expressions that parse these strings and be like, oh, actually, we don't want font tags anymore. I don't know what editor added that, and we're going to strip those out. So you've got this kind of complicated mix of where all of your markup is actually stored. So if we said all of the control remains in the theme layer, no one except for those front-end developers who have access to those files would be able to do it, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. Some people think that's great. You know, I don't want anyone marking up my site except for me, so hands off, it's mine, right? That could be great. But someone's in the real world that's not, you know, you have a team developer who's really passionate, then you have like a business executive who's like, excuse me, I need to change this. And the team developer's like, well, you're in charge of my job, I guess I should let you do it, right? So that doesn't always work. It could also be considered a positive that the person who's creating all of that code can put it into version control and manage it that way. How many of you, I don't know, front-end community use version control systems for everything? Okay, awesome. Okay, so yeah, if you can have all that code in version control, you can track any changes, you can roll back stuff if people do things that are bad, and it's a really safe way to maintain stuff. But it can't be edited easily. You've got to have people with technical abilities making those changes. Like, okay, well, you know, I can't get my summer intern to go and update this markup for me or change this class. They need to actually understand what they're doing. Get them into version control, get them into all that other stuff, and the proper procedure for launching, and it takes a while. Another thing that could be problematic is that when you make a change to these files that are determining your ultimate markup, if there was a module or something else at a presentation layer that allowed people to make a change, and someone logs in and says, oh, look, I can change this HTML tag, I can change this, and click save, and they don't see a change, it appears to them that it's broken, right? Because the user interface doesn't know about the code that's overriding it. We're trying to figure out how to change this in Drupal 8. But right now it's really hard to let the interface layer know that it's going to be overridden later on in the process. So that can also be kind of a downside. So let's talk about those interfaces and play with the idea of letting people control things that maybe shouldn't normally be controlled through user interface. So this happens lots of different places in the process of the Drupal's execution cycle. Mostly it happens before a page is ever rendered, right? An administrator came in early on and said, when someone's viewing an article, it's going to use these kind of tags. When there's a field on that article, it's going to use these kind of tags. When there's something in the sidebar, it's going to use these kind of tags. And then when the page is built, it's already been set in stone. So it's part of the database for Dreamweaver information. So as Drupal says, okay, what goes on this page? You get content and you get configuration out of your database. And they get married together in this wrapper of tags. So that's great. Administrators can use it. People with higher level admins can change it. You don't need to be a HTML, CSS, JavaScript viewer to make a change, which is great. I have a little asterisk here that says that you can't keep code in version control. You actually can. Most of Drupal's configurations are what's called exportable, which means that you can flatten it to code and store it in the database, read it from either database or file, or however you want to do it. And you can have config changes saved in code, so you can manage it through version control. But if you're changing it through the user interface on a live site, that's not actually going to be part of your cycle. The way that I do most of my development is I do a bunch of stuff in the browser configurations, I export all the code, and then I tell the live site to run off code only. So it's still kind of a process of do it on the dev site, export its code, push it to the live site, and that kind of removes the flexibility of you can change whatever you want, wherever you want. So it's, you know, plus and minus there. But in this way, if you were running only off of your database configurations, it would be really fast to make those changes. And if you have all of your configurations done in user interfaces, they can play really nicely together, and one won't be breaking another one. You won't have template files that bluntly say, I don't care what the user interface said, I'm overriding it, because all of the information is coming from interfaces and configuration in the back. So the question is, how do you build user interfaces, functional user interfaces, that can actually achieve this? And the answer is you can't do it very well. We're entering into this issue where too much functionality becomes unusable, right? We've been struggling with this for forever, not even in web like VCRs, right? No one can ever figure out how to use a VCR as soon as they add more buttons than like stop, play, record, pause, right? You add more than that, it's like clock set, I can't do anything. So interfaces are hard, we know that. I've got a couple of examples of really bad user interfaces that we've come up with in Drupal, and we're trying to improve all of them in the next version of Drupal, and we're going to need some help from anyone who's a user interface designer, so if you want to work on it, let me know. The fields user interface, or what's called fields UI in Drupal, is really painful. You have to go through this process of basically selecting your database configuration before you can decide like what kind of input widgets you want people to use, because they're dependent on each other. Like, oh, you know, this should be serialized array. Gives you a different interface than it's an image. And then once you finally get your like data structure and input configuration, then you start thinking about what it looks like on the way out. But usually people start with a wireframe where they're like, this is what it looks like on the way out. And so they're like, oh wait, how do I want it to look on the way in? Oh wait, how do I want the database to be organized? And it's just a really crazy workflow of trying to figure out how to get that all organized. So if you're trying to add into that, what kind of markup do you want wrapped around it? It gets even crazier. This is our listing interface for creating views. Again, we already need to ask where the data is coming from and how you want it formatted, and do you want it in the sidebar, do you want it in the page, does it have a path, does it need a menu link, does it have, there's just a gazillion questions about creating a list. And so now we're going to say, okay, well now that you're creating a list, what kind of markup do you want on the outside of the list? What about the inside of the list? And that also gets a little overwhelming. And in Drupal 7, the current version of Drupal you'd install, there's a different user interface for blocks. In Drupal 8, we're going to try and use something similar to what in Drupal 7 is called panels, which basically lets you control your layout and place your blocks into these layouts. And the panels interface in Drupal 7 needs a lot of work. It's written by the same guy who wrote the views interface, so very complicated, very sophisticated, lots of options. No one knows how to use the user interface. But we recognize that we need the functionality it provides. So we're trying to build a new interface that lets people place blocks, and while placing a block say, oh, actually, this should have an nav tag. So that could also be really hard. So the question is really, where do you draw the line? How much control is too much control, and when is it okay? So I have a feature freeze for Drupal 8, which is the end of the line when we can get into new stuff. It's December 1st this year. And then we're going to be spending a lot of time fixing bugs, writing interfaces, trying to figure out how to make stuff usable. And we're hoping that Drupal 8 will come out fall of next year. That, of course, depends on how fast the development cycle goes. Drupal doesn't tend to ship until it's ready. So we don't really have any deadlines. It's like, you know, when's it out? Well, it'll be out when we're done. And if we have too many bugs, it won't come out at all. And it'll be, you know, a couple years. It was a really long time between Drupal 6 and Drupal 7. Just, we changed so much stuff that we had to spend a really long time fixing all the stuff we broke. We're hoping that we'll be faster in Drupal 8. We're not really sure. So now is the time that we can make these decisions about what to control where. And so I'm really interested in getting feedback from people outside the Drupal community as to how to actually do this. So I've got a couple of demos of these interfaces. So I know screenshots are great, but they don't actually give you a feeling of how they actually work. And I can show you the stuff that people really liked and some propositions for where we might add stuff people might not like and how we can actually do it. So I have here the exact same website we have screenshots of, which has articles. It's not very interesting content. I'm sure that would be great for presentations. I don't want to try and read it. But if you want a career in pharmacy technicianism or whatever, visit this website later. But basically what it is just an article aggregator. There's a bunch of content on it, and they're all organized in different ways, and you can browse around through it. So it's a very simple example. It's not like, you know, Randy.com or Britney Spears or Economist, but it's got the same problems. So I'm currently logged as an administrator. I have it set up so that I have a little navigation tree so I can see some of the more navigation things. And there's a feature in Drupal called contextual administration. So if I look at something over here in the sidebar, you get a little cogwheel, the little options to edit directly from here, the thing you're looking at. So if we start with a view, this is this list. I can edit it directly from here, and it'll pop me into the views interface. This is the overwhelming airplane dashboard style interface of all of these options. And the place where we managed to vary the configurations for HTML settings are underneath options for any given field. So this view contains a little tiny image thumbnail, a title, and a count of, for example, how many times this article has been read. So if I wanted to change the tags on that title, I can click on the title. There's a little collapsed field set, so you don't notice it right away. But if I pop that open, there's little options here for customizing the HTML for the field and for the label of that field. I don't actually have a label on here, so we're going to use field instead. If you check the box, some options appear here for you to be able to choose the HTML element. So this is a user interface for writing HTML. This is kind of nuts, but all right. So let's say rather than having it be a div tag, which is what it defaults to, we're going to change it to be like a H6 or something. And then if we apply, update, and save, it'll take us back to the page. And you'll notice that all the little titles in the sidebar will get a little bit bigger, or in this case smaller. Slightly different formatting. If we look at the markup, it's now that H6 tag. So really fast, easy way to make these changes, but maybe dangerous. I mean, if your designer hasn't written a style for an H6 tag and your administrator says, I want these to be bigger or makes them bigger, then you kind of break things. There isn't the kind of consistency and control you'd like to have. So it's really easy to make those changes. And not just here, but the way views work is that they'll inherit from place to place. So anywhere else that have the same listing of here, it'll update globally, which could also be really handy. Another thing we could control, I don't know if this one has any, here we go. So at the bottom of a piece of content, I've got a list of categories. And this is a field that's added onto this article. And so if I wanted to be able to control the markup that wraps around that category listing, we can do that by using the field UI. So this is this interface where we have all of these fields attached to it. In this case, I've got one here called category. It's a term reference field, user references, system of taxonomy. And I can change that field in the same way, let's see, with this wrapper markup dropdown. So it's like, okay, now I can choose an HTML tag to wrap around this field. So if I wanted it to be, I don't know, like an item list instead. We can go back and look at our listing here. Might have some caching turned on here, but in theory, you could change the markup around different fields on your content type. So if you had an image field, you might have noticed that I had the image is at the top left of every article is actually a field. It's not an inline image. And so I could change the tags around that image to be figure. I could add a second field called caption. I could stick it inside. There's just a bunch of different things you could do in configuration by clicking buttons in your browser to make you build the markup you want. So we're facing this issue where these interfaces are already overwhelming. If you're a Drupal expert, you're like, no problem, let's add a field, stick a thing on it, install a module, do whatever. But if you're new to Drupal and you have to build a website, and you're confronted with decisions like what kind of wrapper do you want around your list item on the 6th content type you've built, you're going to run away screaming. And so what we've got to try and figure out how to do with Drupal 8 is give people a really straightforward interface that lets them just build a website, and then try and find a way to be like, if you're an expert, you can click over here, or you can turn on this other feature, and now you can have more stuff. And so I would like to get some feedback from you to start with. Just number one, is control over markup in the user interface a good idea? Or should we maybe say, let's let people override it in code? So in code, if you were a Drupal theme developer, I'm not sure how well you can see this, you basically get a folder of templates in your theme, and you can create all of the nice little HTML code you actually want to have around stuff. But if you have code that checks, for example, like, what did the user interface say this tag should be? It makes the code really ugly. Like, you can't tell whether that's a H1 or a div tag, and then how do you write CSS against that? You've got to make everything really global, which is probably what you want anyway, but in the real world, it doesn't always come out that way. Where do we draw the lines? Do we say, it's always going to win in the code and there's no user interface? Or do we say, if you have a user interface and you're allowed to break it in the code? Or do we say, everything's user interface and you can't write any code anymore? Drupal is a tool for writing code. And how many themes are going to get really angry about having to write HTML without clicking these buttons, right? I don't think that's going to get anyone real happy. So I'd like to kind of open this up for a discussion and get some feedback. So for starters, how many people think that it's at least interesting proposition to expose HTML selection options in the user interface? Okay, interesting proposition, there's like 4 people. So good idea. No one. Okay, so that's kind of what I thought too. But when we gave people this tool for views, they loved it, and I didn't really understand why. So okay, this is good. This is good feedback. So what I think that I want to do is not put any of this stuff into Drupal core. So we can make these decisions about where this functionality comes from, right? And what we're trying to figure out right now is how much does it ship with Drupal and how much do you add on later? And so it looks like from the whole front end community, they're like, oh no, don't get in the way of my markup, which is good because those are the people who want to attract to Drupal. We don't have a lot of front end people in our community, and this is probably why. So I can do that. That would be really great. Okay, so beyond that, if we were to allow control in the UI, this is not probably going to make it into core, but in Trip space. There's a couple of other questions about how we deal with these template files. We could, instead of printing a div tag that looks like HTML people recognize, we could print a variable that's called somewhere from your user interface. Or alternatively, we could have wrappers for every level. So for example, you can have a wrapper that's like when you want a heading tag that's wrapped in H2, here's a template that puts in H2. So a front-end developer could look at it and recognize that's an H2. And then when someone said I want it to be an H3, it would just change the wrapper. So the code style here would be like an include file to an H2 heading or an include file to an H3 heading. But you wouldn't see H3, but you would know where to find it, right? You could go and dig in that file and say, why did Drupal put a div tag inside my H3? Because it might do that. And you can go to remove it, which might also be interesting. So in terms of what our template files might look like, printing variables, bad idea? Good idea. You like printing variables better. Okay, so referencing other template files with specific tags in them, bad idea. Yes, kind of. Okay. So just to throw this out there, does anyone see anything that I'm completely missing in ways that we can solve these problems with different sites needing different markup? Or do you just say leave it to the theme? Every site's gonna have its own theme anyway. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to know too. So the other project I'm working on right now is replacing the theme layer with, this is PHP template. You can see it's fairly confusing because sometimes we have objects that we do things with, and sometimes we have arrays that we do things with, and sometimes we print things, just printing variables, and sometimes we print render things. So here's like a print render. This is just really confusing for new people. We're gonna swap this out for Twig, which is a template engine that has really similar syntax to stuff like Mustache or JavaScript that people will recognize. And the Twig template system, because it's object-oriented, has the ability to be aware of changes in your user interface, or vice versa. We can have some two-way communication there between the template files and the theme layer, or user interface. So what we're gonna try and do at Drupal 8, and probably not going to get it done before December 1st, so it might end up being a module you add to Drupal rather than shipping with it, is having like a default state in the UI. And so if someone says default state, we could allow them the ability to change all these little thingies, and Drupal would have all these ugly files and variables everywhere. But if you're a theme developer and you go, I don't like that ugly mess, I'm going to write my own markup, and it's going to be clean, it's not going to have divs in it, and it's going to always be an H2, and you put that file in your theme, the user interface will go, aha, there's a new file, this thing's been overwritten, and now I'm going to disable the option for someone to use the default setting. And then that way, at least the interface will reflect the fact that you can't change it anymore. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to get those in, and then that way we can kind of do the loop. But we're not going to be able to do that by December 1st. We've got to make some decisions about where to draw the line. So it sounds like leaving everything in the theme is fine. And the fact that we've added that and everyone liked it might just be everyone in the Drupal community is already developers, not front-end people. So keeping templates clean would probably be good. All right, so just out of personal curiosity, since we still have a little bit of time left, how many of you have tried to design markup for content management systems before? Have you run into this problem where like 6 months later someone creates a piece of content and it doesn't work with the HTML output that you originally had? How did you solve that? Regular expressions or?
Well, parser.
A parser. So yeah, removing HTML that was entered on the front end. We do that a lot. Drupal has like a system of everything you put in the user interface gets saved to the database, but it always gets sanitized on the way out. So part of that sanitizing doesn't just worry about like XSS, but you can also say, actually, I don't like this HTML tag, and it can remove it. So we remove script tags that way. We also remove like, a form element tag or whatever it is that they put in there that they shouldn't have been putting in there. So that's a really useful thing on our end, but it makes our content creators really angry. So we're trying to figure out, like, well, I don't know. Okay. What about like layout problems? If you have this issue where you build a website and then like 6 months later, you're like, well, we need this splash page that's completely different. Have you ever dealt with a user interface that lets them build their own splash pages, or do you just, call me and I'll fix it? Okay. So part of our blocks and layouts initiative is going to be a user interface for building layouts. And even crazier than that, it's going to be a user interface for building responsive layouts. So they're going to have to choose like homepage on desktop, homepage on Google, homepage on iPad, and like drag and drop all the blocks around and put them in. Trying to figure out how to do that, and then say, well, on mobile, this is actually an aside, and on desktop, it's an article, and over here, and it's just, I can't even think about how crazy that interface would be. But yeah, you should keep watching. It's going to be a crazy world a year from now. We're going to be like, look what we did, and you guys will be like, oh, we did that a year ago. We moved on. We do better stuff. That's kind of how it goes. All right. Well, are there any questions? We've got a couple minutes left before lunch. Yes.
Do you have an example that you can show the new
so there is a distribution in Drupal called Spark that already does all of the mobile responsive layout craziness. What I want to show you though is an example of this panels module that does some of the layout stuff right now. The drag and drop. This is not a responsive version. Spark uses this, but it goes overboard. So this is an example of a wireframe of what the site looks like on a taxonomy term listing page. This is if you're looking at content in a specific category and you click on the name of the category, it goes to this page. And we've got 3 what are called blocks here at the top of the page, and then 2 and 3 columns in the middle. And if I wanted to, for example, move the content from the middle column to the content in the left column, you can just drag and drop stuff around. Everything is a little indicator once it's been moved. And then you just hit update and save, and it'll spot where the content goes on the actual page. So this is standard panels. There's also an option in here to use what's called an in-place editor. I don't know if I have turned on, I think this is really cool. So rather than dealing with it in a wireframe, you deal with actual content. Sorry, panels, in-place editor. And that's really sexy. Okay, so let's go to a category page. So, for example, these are all category pages. Let's go to like California. So here we've got our content in this crazy layout. So most pages it's just this 2-column layout, which is very straightforward. But on the category page, my local site will upload. Here we go. It's got a couple of different things at the top, the 3 columns in the middle, and one's in the bottom. And where's my render? It'll give us this button on the bottom of the page that will say edit this page. Jeez, still. Actually, we're in this editor render. Oh, this is so again, interface is really complicated, means live demos don't always work. Okay, there we go. Now we got this giant bar on the bottom, and if you click customize this page, everything on the page becomes editable, and so you can just grab your content and move it around on the actual page. Whoa. That's pretty cool, right? Yes. No. And then when you hit save, it does a Ajax reload on the content editable part of the page. Breaks everything like that. Pretty
Does
exciting.
Spark work in a similar way?
So this uses a bunch of custom JavaScript that was written specifically for Drupal and the panels module. Spark uses the Aloha WYSIWYG editor, which has all of this inline drag and drop stuff anyway. So what we're trying to do is get the Aloha WYSIWYG editor into Drupal core so that all of our text areas will have WYSIWYGs on them. We're a little behind on that. But then we also want to use it for the drag and drop ability for building threads. So, pretty cool. This is, by the way, this drag and drop thing is like my favorite module in all of Drupal because it's fun. But, cool, man. All right, well, thanks, guys.